know how the heck we're going to know.
Okay.
Oh, it says live. Okay, I'm going to assume we're live. Well, that was funny. Welcome everyone. I'm going to assume that you are all here for our webinar today called Wheat Wise: Separating Fact from Fiction. I'm Michele Tuttle. I'm a registered dietitian, certified specialist in sports nutrition. I also happen to be a Team USA amateur elite triathlete, and I've been part of that organization for, my goodness, over a decade now. In any case, what we're going to do here today is I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, a little bit about the Wheat Foods Council, and then I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Brett Carver, who is going to be today talking to us all about the ins and outs of wheat breeding. And then I'm going to come back and follow it up with some details about carbohydrates, fiber, and the importance of basically addressing some myths around wheat that we really need to talk about. Okay, so I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Wheat Foods Council that is sponsoring today's session. So let me just start there. This is an organization of wheat growers and farmers, as well as millers and producers all across the US, specializing in US wheat. Whole purpose of this nonprofit organization that's been around for over 50 years is education. Okay, the whole point to talk to people and everyone about the importance of grains, carbohydrates, and particularly fiber, and to provide resources to the many audiences out there that require them. One of the audiences that we're very interested in speaking to are personal trainers. And so I'm hoping today that many of you out there are related to the fitness world in some capacity, though I'm sure we have people who are just generally interested in nutrition, as well as dietitians and others who are part of the many, many people who are interested in the topic of wheat and health. So, as I said, I'm Michele Tuttle. I'm a triathlete first and foremost, but I'm also a registered dietitian. Been a dietitian not quite as long as I've been an athlete, but pretty close. And I'll look forward to seeing you in a bit. I'm going to turn things over now to Brett Carver.
All right. Thank you, Michele, and good to see you again. And good to know that everybody is out there, and I thank you for attending this webinar. I hope you are interested in learning something about wheat. I'm Brett Carver. I'm on the faculty at Oklahoma State University and have been since the mid-1980s. I was a graduate of the University of Georgia, went on to North Carolina State University for my graduate degrees, and came then to Oklahoma from there. And I have been breeding wheat since the 80s. I've actually been developing commercial wheat varieties for consumption since the late 1990s. So I have a few things to say about what's happened in wheat breeding and what's not happened. So let's go ahead and get started with that, Michele.
Okay, let's go.
So let's just start with something I encounter quite a bit online, or actually directly in conversation with other people. I hear a lot of myths, but this one probably rises to the top as being the most frequently heard. And that is, I hear modern wheat, specifically wheat gluten, is less healthy to consume than wheat from a century ago. And that's about how long wheat breeding has been going on in the United States and elsewhere. And this is due to supposedly breeding practices such as hybridization. That's a term that I wonder might be misunderstood. I think it's at the core of why this myth has come to be what it is. And so I'm going to take some time now to talk about what is hybridization in wheat, because it is the usual thing, but it's also not the usual thing. So Michele, first of all, the truth is current wheat varieties, the ones that we are producing today, they actually differ very little from the wheat grown 100 years ago. Again, that's how long wheat breeding has been going on in modern time. There has been some similarities, but there's also some differences that I want to point out a little bit later. Okay, so let's talk about now hybridization. Michele, hybridization is really just a practice of cross-pollination. It's crossing, what we call crossing. It's the introduction of pollen from one plant onto the egg-bearing flowers of another plant. And it occurs in any plant breeding program. And so hybridization in wheat is essentially no different than any other plant, whether it's vegetable, fruits, ornamental, whatever. Now, the mechanics may be a little bit different because the flour structure is different, but the science is still the same. Next slide. What's really different about wheat is that it originated by what I would consider miraculous hybridizations that occurred in nature millennia ago. And this is not the same for many other crops. And wheat really goes back well beyond human civilization. We'll get into that. So the crosses that are made by wheat breeders today emulate those which can occur and have occurred in nature, but the ones that occur in nature are much, much slower. All right. Well, why make hybridizations? Why even bother? Well, the one common objective is to combine the best characteristics of different parents into a single and natural progeny for a growing human population. I'll give you one very general example that drives my own wheat breeding program. That is to produce higher yielding wheat varieties with equal or better quality than what we had before. And these are shots right out of my greenhouses in Stillwater, Oklahoma. And so, yes, let's go on then. The hybridization process just starts the breeding process. And the breeding process in wheat, winter wheat that we grow in the Great Plains of the United States, requires about 10 years to develop a wheat variety. So the first 5 are involved with letting the wheat plant do what it naturally does, and that is to inbreed. Wheat likes to inbreed. So we let it inbreed for those 5 generations or so. And then for the next 5 generations, we test those inbred progeny. And I'm showing you here a picture of a critical turning point in the breeding program where we now have inbred progenies and we want to develop the progenies, increase the seed of those progenies so that we can test them all across the state of Oklahoma and beyond. And an arrow just points to one specific progeny from a 3-foot row. And this is just a portion of the field that you're seeing that would be about 5 times this size, because we're talking about 50,000 progenies to evaluate each and every year. I'll also point out, you can see the houses in the background. This field is located a mere 4 blocks from my house in Stillwater. It's the closest I can get to the breeding program before it goes statewide. So next slide. So let's just now the left pictures hone in on what these little miniature 3-foot rows look like earlier in development. So we have more green tissue. I will select, depending on what I'm looking at, I will select desirable progenies that will then go into a larger area of the field, a 40 square foot plot to be exact for us, in that middle picture, where we will test thousands of progenies. So the picture on the top is a drone shot of a nursery that occurs each and every year right outside of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. This is Chickasha. There's about 2,500 experimental lines in that picture that we are testing for farmer acceptance and, of course, human consumption. And, of course, we end up with a variety that goes into the marketplace. And I'll just show you one particular variety that came out of this program called Gallagher. It's been a leading variety in Oklahoma for many years, and also very popular in Texas and Kansas. If you have consumed a slice of bread or any bread product, bread flour, you have probably consumed the flour produced from Gallagher wheat. Next slide. So let's go back now to cover a little bit of history, because a lot of things have happened in wheat. And I can tell it like this. Wheat has been bred in nature for hundreds of thousands of years. Wheat breeding by humans, wheat breeders, has only been occurring for about 100 years. And there's a big difference now in that time scale. So let's shrink that hundreds of thousands of years down to 2 slides. I'm going to try to do that. So about 10,000 years ago, wheat in the form of what's called einkorn, and you might have seen einkorn in the grocery store. We can produce einkorn today, produce it commercially. But einkorn, or a relative of einkorn, happened to hybridize naturally. Nobody did this. This was 380,000 years ago, long before human civilization ever got started. Hybridized with a wild grass to produce a plant called emmer. Here's another familiar name to some of you. Emmer is a source of wheat that you can purchase in the grocery store. But I want to point out some really important things here. You see the red letters. Each of those letters represent genomes. And a genome is just simply a collection of chromosomes. So each plant or each species, so the einkorn relative, contributed what is called the A genome. This wild grass contributed the B genome, and they produced then the progeny, which is a combination of those two genomes called A and B. Einkorn first, then Emmer second. Emmer, the scientific name will be Triticum dicoccum. Notice that einkorn is Triticum monococcum. Monococcum simply means single berry. Dicoccum means 2 berries per flower. So yes, the yield doubled just naturally in nature. Okay, so what happened after that? Let's go on to the next slide. All right, so emmer wheat is really important to human civilization, just as einkorn was. But emmer allowed humans to move out of the Fertile Crescent where the einkorn was being used to depend upon by humans. And this expansion led to ancient Egyptians for thousands of years relying on emmer wheat as their staple crop. It's been around quite a bit. In fact, Julius Caesar took many of those varieties of emmer wheat and brought them back to his empire to support the Roman Empire. And those grains have come to be called collectively farro or farro, and that's another common name possibly to you. You can buy farro, which now is sort of a combination of einkorn and emmer and maybe spelt in the grocery store. So emmer is sort of the turning point here. Emmer was then domesticated over thousands of years to produce, if you see at the bottom left, what's called durum wheat. No change in genome. It's still the A and B genomes, but through domestication, it's a more modern form of emmer. And durum is our source of pasta. Okay, 2 genomes. But also another hybridization occurred spontaneously in nature, and this was a big one. This is where emmer hybridized, and it can still do this in nature. Emmer hybridized with a wild grass called Agellops toshii, which contributed now the D genome. The A, B, and D genomes came together to produce what is called common or bread wheat, although not all common wheat is used to make bread, but we just call it bread wheat for short. The wilder version, the non-domesticated version of common wheat called Triticum aestivum, is spelt wheat. Yes, you can buy spelt wheat in the grocery store. So you really can see in front of you now the history and the main family tree, the main trunk of this tree of wheat. And it's really important to realize that the genetic changes that have occurred in wheat over the millennial have the changes have been so much greater during these spontaneous and natural instances that occurred relative to modern wheat breeding. Again, it's only been going on for 100 years. I like to look at this as like furniture in a house. You know, what these natural hybridizations did was introduce some furniture into the house. What we are doing through modern wheat breeding is just moving furniture around. Still, the pieces are there. The same pieces are there, but they're in different combinations, or maybe they have a different look to them. But we're just moving furniture around. And now I'm looking at furniture as genes. We're moving genes around in different combinations to make new progenies today. I sometimes wonder just where human civilization would be today if these hybridizations never occurred. Well, we wouldn't have wheat as we know it today. We certainly wouldn't. We would have to depend on some other staple crop. But also realize that for 10,000 years, humans evolved. For 10,000 years, wheat evolved. And so this coevolution occurred where we had a natural coexistence. Humans depended upon wheat and its evolution as it occurred. All right, so let's go on, Michelle. So how then is today's wheat any different than, say, 100 years ago when wheat breeding started in the modern era? Well, of course, we have a higher genetic yield potential. That's what we want. We need to produce more yield so we can feed more people. And this has come about through, again, moving the furniture around, new gene combinations, not necessarily new genes. To me, a new gene might come from a wild relative of wheat, maybe one of those that I mentioned, like toshii or monococcum. But there are other wild relatives of wheat that you don't see on the main trunk of the family tree. And those contribute to wheat breeding today, because now we can access some of the traits that were lost during the natural breeding process that occurred over thousands of years. And then we also have better local adaptation. We're breeding varieties, at least I breed varieties for the southern Great Plains. I'm not breeding for where Michele resides along the eastern coast. We're breeding for the Great Plains, where we know we have certain diseases, we have a certain climate, we have certain insects that we try to address and provide resistance to some of these problems. And then another thing, yes, by achieving higher yields, we are putting more mass into the grain. That's the part of the plant that we consume. We don't eat the leaves and we don't eat the stems. We're eating the grain. And so, yes, there's a higher proportion of the plant mass now dedicated to the grain. This is just a better use of resources. Resources being water, of course, sunlight, we need that, but also fertilizer and fertility that's naturally present in the soil. Here's something you might not realize, and I find it a little bit surprising to some degree, but there is actually greater genetic diversity in our commercial fields today than there was 100 years ago, because we relied on so few varieties 100 years ago to provide our food source at that time. So, and this is documented in the link that I've shown there at the bottom right. It's a fascinating paper that really documents how diversity has changed for the better. Next slide. So how is today's wheat the same? Okay, we still have the A and the B and the D genomes in hexaploid wheat, that is bread wheat. We still have the A and the B genomes in durum wheat, the source of pasta. Same genomes, same chromosomes. In fact, if you look at the genetic sequence in these genomes, in these chromosomes, to some degree, we are at 98% similarity in sequence still today versus some of these ancient relatives. It's just amazing. The 2% has made a difference in terms of yield, but the rest of it is pretty much the same sequence. These genes that we're working with are native. They're endogenous to the family tree of wheat. They're highly conserved. They must be if we're 98% similar, just like the progenitors. At the current time, there are no genetically modified wheat varieties in commercial production. We use genetic modification for research purposes. There is interest in using genetic modification as a breeding practice. So far, that has not occurred in terms of commercial production of wheat. In terms of gluten and carbohydrates, the amount of gluten, that's basically the amount of protein in wheat. 80% of the protein is gluten. Those amounts and kinds are pretty much the same. We really have not changed or added any kind of protein that's different from what was already present in wild relatives or the ancient relatives. And here's another one that I spent the last, from 2014 until 2020, I did this research to find out for sure, okay, what has changed in terms of the gluten that we are consuming and in terms of its amino acid composition or amino acid sequence, because it's the amino acid sequence that can cause an adverse reaction if we have autoimmunity or celiac disease. If we are celiac, we are responding to certain sequences of amino acids. And so I evaluated 100 years worth of wheat breeding, those varieties, in several environments over several years to look at this concentration of what we call the immunogenic peptide. It's a 33 amino acid peptide. And lo and behold, I didn't know this when I started the research. I needed to find out. Lo and behold, there has been absolutely no change in that concentration of that particular amino acid sequence. And that's important. If we're going to look at anything that might cause gluten sensitivity, we need to look at this sequence more than anything else. And it kind of makes sense. I mean, no wheat breeder would be selecting for the concentration of that peptide. But things can happen by unintended consequences. And it certainly has not happened in this case. And then final slide, Michele. How can we make tomorrow's wheat even better than today's wheat? There are some ways we can do this, and we're working on it. First of all, we're trying to produce a flour that would enable a cleaner label. Why are we concerned about a cleaner label? Well, just look at the label. on any bread product. There's some things on there you might not understand. I don't understand, in fact, myself, but I do understand that the label contains ingredients that help the flour that's produced today withstand the stresses of a modern bakery. And so if a flour does not have, say, the mixing tolerance that we need to produce bread at a very rapid rate, things like a dough conditioner or vital wheat gluten will be added to that flour to enable that product to be produced. We want to produce a flour that removes the dependence on dough conditioners and vital wheat gluten as an additive. We're also looking at kernel color in wheat, and you know that fruits and vegetables come in different colors, and those colors really mean something for our health. Usually a pigment such as a purple pigment or a blue pigment, orange, red, they often provide what are called phytonutrients, and those phytonutrients come in the form of one particular phenolic compound called anthocyanins. Anthocyanins give us pigmentation in plants. Anthocyanins are not present to a high degree, to a significant degree in wheat naturally. Red wheat or white wheat does not contain a high concentration of anthocyanins, but when the kernel color becomes blue or it becomes purple, yes, we are able to bring those anthocyanins in. Anthocyanins are antioxidants, and maybe Michele might mention something about antioxidants later, but they're very important for our health. We think this is a good way to introduce more antioxidants into our food supply. And then finally, fiber. A higher proportion of natural fiber in milled flour. You might not understand or realize that, gosh, about 10% of the weight of the kernel is fiber. But we don't get that in, say, a slice of white bread. Number one, we're not utilizing the bran that would be naturally present in a whole wheat flour. But two, we simply do not have the kinds of carbohydrates which make fiber present in wheat that we would like to have. But wheat just happens to be our most common source of dietary fiber. And so if we're going to use wheat for our source of fiber, maybe we should try to make fiber more prevalent in that kernel. And there are several ways to do this. And some of those ways have already been accomplished and they're already on the market. I would just encourage you to go online and look at a flour product called Health Sense. It's produced now from non-GMO, naturally hybridized, conventionally hybridized wheat varieties that have a different composition of certain carbohydrates. And the two that are important in wheat are amylose and amylopectin. Amylose is that kind of fiber. It's a long chain of glucose that resists digestion in the small intestine, goes on into our colon to feed our microbiome, gives us better gut health. What's good for our microbiome is going to be good for us. And so a higher amylose composition would be preferred over a higher amylopectin, which is a more branched kind of carbohydrate that is rapidly digested in our small intestine to produce glucose in our bloodstream. Yes, we need glucose for energy. We need it for our brains. But do we need the amount of glucose that we're consuming today? Maybe not. So if we can flip those ratios, and these ratios are not just limited to wheat. I mean, it's a 3-to-1 ratio usually in plants of amylopectin to amylose. If we can change that ratio, then I think we are producing a much better source of natural fiber in our diet. And there's other ways to do it besides just amylose and amylopectin. There are other sources of carbohydrates in wheat that could be increased through conventional breeding. There's a movement across this country that engages all the wheat breeders in land-grant universities and beyond to look at a certain carbohydrate called arabinoxylan. Arabinoxylan is naturally present in wheat. It's just arabinoxylan is a chain of arabinose and xylose. These are 5-carbon sugars. And this arabinoxylan can serve as a source of dietary fiber. It's naturally low in wheat. However, there are places or there are accessions of wheat that can be used in breeding to produce and breed a naturally higher fiber content based on arabinoxylan. This organization is called Coalition for Grain Fiber. Look it up. You'll know what's going on across the United States in trying to improve the fiber content of wheat. So I'll stop there. Michele, you want to pick it up?
Sure, sure. Brett, first, I just want to say thank you for simplifying a complicated topic. I'm not sure, how many of us remember our genetic portion of our biology classes from way back when, but that was a really great explanation of what
Good.
hybridization is and is not, how it affects wheat. And I think, any of those out in our audience, I just want to remind you, I didn't actually tell you up front. If you have questions, we hope you'll put them in the comments section so that when we get done with today's presentation, Brett and I can address those questions. But for now, yep, I'm going to go on. I'm going to build on what Brett had to tell us. I'm going to address this myth. Okay. So Brett addressed the whole myth of whether wheat has changed and whether this has affected anything. And I'm going to address the myth about whether wheat is bad for our gut health. And I think this is critical because one of the things that I run into again and again, for actually more than a decade now, is that, oh my God, that gluten, that is just so bad. And that wheat, it's terrible for our gut health. We have to eat this. Usually what people go to is a high protein diet or what they consider to be a gluten-free diet. Um, we're going to talk a little bit about that because sometimes I'm not so sure people actually have their definitions right. But in any case, I'm going to address whether how wheat affects our gut health and basically also some unintended consequences of following a gluten-free diet. Okay. First of all, what I want to say is this. The truth, one of the big truths, is that a gluten-free diet is actually lower in fiber, lower in nutrients, and quite difficult to follow. If any of you out there actually have someone in your family or someone who is true celiac, they have been diagnosed by a doctor through the testing, and it's, basically celiac is a very serious autoimmune disease that affects about 1 to 3% of people who are genetically predisposed. You cannot tolerate any gluten whatsoever. From any source. And there are a lot of other grains out there that can be slightly contaminated with gluten if they're processed in a plant that also handles wheat. True celiac sufferers cannot handle any of it. It will set off serious consequences. Okay, so that was the purpose of a gluten-free diet initially. And thanks to some, I'm going to call it erroneous publication, to a book back about maybe 12, 13 years ago called Wheat Belly. A lot of people took the message that somehow gluten-free diets were actually the way to go to be healthier, to actually lose weight, to avoid chronic disease. And I'm going to talk a lot about that in the next few slides. So let me build a little bit about these gluten-free diets, though, and why you need to be careful if you or someone is someone who actively avoids wheat or gluten because they think they're trying to be healthy. So here's one of the things, and Brett referred to this as well. In the United States, wheat provides most of the fiber in the typical US diet. Now, the US diet is not super high in fiber to begin with. And what little there is largely coming from wheat. So when we eliminate the wheat, we pretty much eliminate all the fiber. And I'm going to get into the real danger behind that because that is serious. All right. The other thing you need to understand is, let's say you've decided, let's say you've had to become gluten-free by medical necessity. Something really critical to know is that most wheat flours are enriched with nutrients, okay? B vitamins, iron, etc., folate, but other flours made from, say, almond or, rice or anything else, they're not typically enriched. So what happens is that some people assume, well, I don't need that white flour. It doesn't have anything in it. Not true. It's got a ton of nutrients. It's got folate, B vitamins, niacin, iron, all sorts of things that you don't even think about it. But most of our population gets a lot of those nutrients, that some of which are very in short supply, directly from wheat-based foods. So when you decide to cut out the tortillas, the pizza, the bread, you're cutting out a whole array of nutrients. Most people don't think about it that way. They're looking at it from maybe a caloric standpoint, but it is much, much more serious than that. All right. So let's take a look at the actual truth. Wheat's effect on digestive health. This is critical. We actually, we're so funny. Humans we have big egos. We like to think that we do everything ourselves and we're all powerful and this is lovely. I think the microbiome is probably the biggest thing happening on the health front today. If you think about it, you have somewhere between 100 to 200 trillion microbes living in your body. You absolutely need them. They are critical for everything to do with you being alive. And yet, no one thinks about this. All right. There are more cells in your microbiome than there are in your human body. And without them, you could probably digest very little of the food that you eat. Okay. So that's truth, basic truth about the microbiome. Now, let's talk a little bit about what that microbiome needs to be healthy, because if you don't feed it correctly, it will start basically cannibalizing itself, and you will end up with something called leaky gut and many other sensitivities to health. So if you eliminate all carbohydrate from your diet for whatever reason, there are going to be gut health consequences. That is absolute truth. All right. So, first of all, we know the brain, okay, most important organ to keep us alive other than our heart, thrives on glucose. It requires carbohydrates. We can break down many foods to become glucose. So the brain has to have glucose, but can get it a number of ways. The microbiome requires carbohydrate, and it requires a particular kind to be effectively very healthy, etc. And that is fiber, the one that Brett also mentioned. If we deprive the microbiome of fiber, it is not able to produce something that it requires for its own health and maintenance called short-chain fatty acids. Without short-chain fatty acids, we have a dramatic increase in inflammatory diseases. We have a dramatic increase in type 2 diabetes. We have a dramatic increase in obesity and heart disease. That's interesting. So if we take out all the fiber, and much of that's coming from wheat, we end up with all these diseases. Interesting, don't you think? And true. At the end of this whole presentation, I'm going to give you some resources to back this up. But this may fly directly in the face of what a lot of us currently believe, and that's because at the moment protein is the I call it the wonder child of nutrition at the moment. Just happens to be receiving. It can do no wrong, which is not true. Nutrition is very much a balancing. It requires balance in all regards. And one of the biggest balances that we are out of balance with is a source of fiber in our diet to feed the microbiome. In any case, okay, moving on. Let's talk a little bit about the association of wheat and whole grains with chronic diseases, because this is another thing we've been hearing. We keep hearing that, wheat is eating those carbs. This is why we have so much heart disease and why we have so much obesity and all type 2 diabetes and everything. And in fact, this is simply not true. Okay. We need to look very carefully at what the research says about this. Okay. First of all, whole grains, okay, including wheat, are more closely linked than fruits and vegetables to a lower risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and it happens to be the polyphenols that are part of wheat. Those brown coverings that Brett talked about, that fiber stuff and other things, those colors that are in there, they're brown and they're boring and they're powerful. So this is what I find fascinating. I'm not sure how this message got lost, that, we think fruits and vegetables are, the be all end all, and they are marvelous. But remember, when we're talking about the power of plants, we also have to talk about the power of grains, and that includes wheat. Okay. So another thing I want to mention, back in 2019, the Wheat Foods Council asked a researcher named Glenn Gaser out of Arizona State University to do a very deep dive on the association between refined grains and disease? Was there any, validity there that eating more, basically white flour, etc., leads to more disease? And here's what he found. I mean, first of all, I need to remind you of something. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans, which is the best summary we've got of all the best health information and leading to the best, healthy body, says at the moment that half your grains should be whole. Half. That means the other half can be not so whole. Okay. So that's number one. Number two, according to 11 meta-analyses that he looked at that involved 32 different studies and 24 populations of people, these are large, massive studies. Refined grains are not associated with any of those diseases. Okay, there's just simply no powerful proof. I'm not going to say it, but I actually the research points more toward, again, when there is imbalance in the diet, perhaps too much protein, perhaps too much fat, perhaps too much of a lot of other things, that's when we develop problems. And it comes down to, again, we need to look very closely on the connection between grains, fiber, and health. All right. Let's look a little bit about this. Okay, this is another truth. Higher protein diets lead to more digestive issues. Now, that's kind of interesting because many, many people opt for higher protein diets because they're having digestive issues. Okay, they're having bloating and gas and all kinds of things. And because of that, they'll draw an association. Oh my God, I ate that oatmeal. Oh, my stomach, or I ate those beans and whoa. Bottom line is, without the carbohydrates, without the fiber, more constipation, more slower gut motility. Things sit in there longer, things that we probably don't want to sit in there a long time. And when we eat a higher protein diet at the expense of grains, we displace other vitamins and minerals, things like, B vitamins, folate, other things that we get from grain foods. All right. Here's another one. Again, I just referred to this. Digestive disorders are not solved by eliminating wheat. Now, okay, having said that, yes, we talked about already the fact that if you have celiac, that can be definitely, a lot can be resolved by eliminating wheat. That is a very small percentage of people. Most people are eliminating wheat and gluten in particular because they're trying to avoid something else. If you happen to be somebody who has serious gut dysbiosis, meaning you are reacting to all kinds of foods and all kinds of sensitivities, and it seems like no matter what you eat, it's causing, distress. Or if you have irritable bowel syndrome, which is rampant in the US, okay, or Crohn's disease, these are any of the number of things that could be happening. It might seem eliminating wheat is like, I'll do that and I'm going to feel better. I'm going to also eliminate dairy. I'm going to eliminate all these foods. Well, it turns out that if you do all that, okay, you might have some short-term relief, but long-term, you may end up with much more serious problems, okay? It turns out that if we continue to become more restrictive, lower the variety of what we feed our microbiome, it becomes more and more reactive when it does see things that become novel. Let me give you an example. Let's say eating a higher fiber food is not something you do naturally. Okay, so I don't know, maybe you decide you're going to add more fiber, you're going to add shredded wheat, maybe you're going to eat beans, maybe you're going to eat, any other whole grain thing that you can come up with. And all of a sudden, 6 to 8 hours later, it's like, whoa, what just happened here? My stomach is distended, etc. That is your microbiome saying, whoa, this is new. We're happy. We're producing stuff. This is great. But it's not going to make you happy. It's going to make them happy. Over time, they adapt. And that does not happen. I'm not talking like months either. I'm talking over a few days, weeks of consuming more fiber, more of a similar food. You get used to it. But when you introduce it and it's not been there for a long time, we need to be a bit careful, small amounts over a few days. All right. Okay. Back to the whole thing. If you are one of those very reactive people, lots of gut health issues, You've heard, I'm sure, the term FODMAPs, okay? That's like everywhere today, and that's fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols, which is a mouthful, just referring to a whole lot of different types of carbohydrates that occur naturally in foods, including wheat and other fruits and vegetables, that cause discomfort if you have sensitivities to them. It's very, very important that you get medical help for what's going on, not that you self diagnose, decide that you have a gluten disorder or something. Go get tested for stuff. And most important advice I can give you as a registered dietitian, keeping a food journal when you are having issues like this or a client is having issues like this is critical, because the best way to figure out what your triggers are, whether you have IBS or something else, is to see the pattern. And it's hard to see the pattern because it doesn't happen immediately after eating a food. It usually happens like anywhere from 6 to 12 hours later, depending on your particular digestive speed. All right. Let's take a look at another truth about wheat and health. First of all, longer fermentation methods make wheat products more digestible. This is true. Okay, who knew? Bottom line is fermented foods are great for the microbiome, and this includes something like sourdough, which is a natural way of leavening bread. It's been around for, again, almost probably as long as wheat's been around, right, Brett? I mean, 10,000 years we've had bread. That's sourdough is the way we used to always leaven bread. All right. And what it does is that if you are someone who does suffer from IBS, it may help improve your symptoms to consume sourdough, okay? Because it helps to lower the FODMAPs. What's going on with that is the lactobacilli, and there are many strains in, sourdough. They basically pre-digest all those FODMAPs that can be irritating to the gut, okay? So the other thing they do, though, is in that pre-digestion, they make other nutrients more available, things like protein and more fiber and more phenolic compounds. So, lots to be gained by including something like sourdough as one of your fermented foods, if that's something you're trying to do more of. All right, let's talk a little bit about sources of information. I think this is really important because, in a world where so many of us get our information from social media or just different, podcasts that we listen to or wherever we tend to hear information of interest, okay? I just want to remind all of us that it's important always to double check what you're hearing. Brett gave you a few ideas of places where you could look up different things about grains and wheat breeding. And I'm going to just remind you that the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control, the World Health Organization, PubMed, with all of its many journals. I know that that's a lot, that we don't all have time to be scouring the research, etc. But it really is important to remember to look a little further than whatever the popular person at the moment is saying about grains and health, etc., or whatever they're talking about. It's always good to look a little further, right? So along those lines, I'm going to just leave this up for a minute. Maybe you want to take a picture of it. In terms of a lot of the topics that I talked about, gluten-free diets being lower in nutrients, and there's another issue out there called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which is a very, very hard to diagnose, define situation. You need to do a little more reading. I mean, rather than just take someone's word for it that maybe you're sensitive to gluten and wheat, maybe look into it a little bit more yourself. And I think these papers are a really good starting point. And then I mentioned the research by Glenn Gaser looking at the connection between refined grains and health. And I think it would be worthwhile to take a look at that as well. Okay. All right. So moving on. Just a final point. I think this is true anytime we're talking about nutrition and health or something to do with food. My viewpoint is this. Absolutely, most people, when they are thinking about nutrition, what they're really thinking about is, how do I get to look like this slide? How do I do that? That's what I want. I want that. Do I need to lose weight? Okay, well, I'll do whatever it takes. I'll eat a high protein diet. I'll cut out all these foods. I'll do this. Nobody really thinks about in terms of, how is this going to affect my overall health if I take this action? There are always unintended consequences of trying to be what we consider to be healthy. My point is this: you may look at that and see perfection. I look at that and I see, a lot going on there. Maybe a little obsessiveness, probably a lot of nutrients cut out. That's not healthy to me. But again, I've had a lot of years of experience of being a dietitian and an athlete. I see things a little differently. So, in any case, looks can be deceiving. Be careful what you are trying to do in your quest for healthiness. And we're getting to that point where we would love to answer questions, Brett and I. And this is how you can contact us if you're interested. And in a second, I'm going to check out the comments, see if we did get any questions. So, again, if you do have some, either now or later, we hope you'll be in touch. And let's take a look. All right. So, I do not see any particular questions. So either all of you were just completely just loved what we had to say, or I'm not sure what. Brett, any thoughts that you have based on what we've been talking about today that we didn't get to say already?
Yeah, I just want to remind our listeners that I'm only one of many wheat researchers across the country. And if you live in a state that produces wheat, it's quite likely that your land grant university has a wheat program, a wheat research program. And if it has a wheat research program, it probably has a wheat extension program. It has a wheat breeding program. These are public employees. They are working for land grants, the People's University. So I would encourage you to contact your local land grant university. Again, if there's a wheat program that you think is there, and it's likely that there is, over half the states will have one in the United States. So, we'd love to talk to you, and we'd love to spread the truth.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great comment. Yeah, and I agree. You definitely have local resources available to you. Um, that goes as well for if you are one of those people who is suffering from gut dysbiosis, whether it's a gastroenterologist or a registered dietitian with a specialty there, you've got resources available to you. So we encourage you to look deeper than just a superficial answer of let me just you heard perhaps, oh, wheat's the problem. Let me just cut that out. Look a little deeper. So, all right. Well, I'm going to assume that all of you are good at the moment and that you do know how to reach us if you'd like to. One last final thing. If you're not familiar with wheatfoods.org, there's a lot of resources about and information about wheat and breeds of wheat and other webinars actually as well that you might want to check out. And so please do. And until next time, Brett and I will say, see you soon.
Goodbye, everybody.
Yeah.